Hi, thanks for joining today's webinar on healthcare marketing. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes here, waiting for a few last-minute attendees to join us. Thanks. Hello and welcome to Highlights Presents Healthcare Marketing. Stop marketing, start engaging. I'm Scott Taylor from Housekeeping Group, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started here. So our goal is to have an interactive discussion today, so feel free to submit any questions that you have through the GoToWebinar platform. And we'll set aside the last few minutes to cover any questions that we see submitted. Don't worry about taking notes. We'll follow up with a video recording of the webinar and then also a blog post that covers some of the highlights. If you'd like to live tweet or follow us while we're live tweeting, go on Twitter and follow the hashtag highlights. And if you have any questions that we don't cover today, feel free to reach out via email at contact@housekepinggroup.com. So just a quick rundown on the GoToWebinar platform. If you see on the right side of your screen, the control panel, you can raise your hand if you have any technical issues, and someone from our team will reach out to resolve them. And then if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the questions text box over there. All right, so I'd like to introduce you to today's presenters. We have Kyle Chandler, our Director of Marketing here at Housekeeping Group, and Brett Colasanti, our Managing Partner.
Great, Scott. Thanks for the intro. Let's just jump into the agenda here. We want to talk briefly about some key initiatives that we always address in healthcare. Talk about one of the questions we always get is, well, where do you start? And how do you do it? So we're going to try to cover those as well. Then we're going to jump into a real world example of one of the key initiatives, give you some key takeaways, and then try to break for the last 10 or 15 minutes and give you guys time for questions. So with that, let's jump in. So I think today, healthcare marketplace, we all agree, is in a is going through an unprecedented time of change as we move from volume-based to value-based care, and as we go through this time of kind of regulatory uncertainty with the laws. So I think one of the things that we try to do is to simplify this by identifying what we call kind of our four key marketing initiatives. So one is always, of course, patient acquisition. Marketing is always trying to drive volume. 2, brand awareness and reputation. 3, population health initiatives. So thinking about getting people into specific programs or specific screenings, things like that. And 4, of course, patient reactivation. So once trying to again, kind of on the population health side, continue to reactivate patients back into the system when when they've missed appointments or have not gone through follow-ups. So the question we get more than any other, of course, is, okay, great, this all makes sense. We all know that healthcare is in a time of change, so where do we start? So we've kind of come up with a list of 5 things that are sort of our best practice strategies to sort of guide you through the process. So first, and of course, is identifying a corporate sponsor and internal champions. This is important. Obviously, the corporate sponsors, pretty obvious to have those people available to support any initiatives we're going to do. But also, we've found that internal champions across different service lines or different departments is also critical as you kind of try to build a base of support for any new projects. Next, we're going to talk about refining the broad kind of healthcare personas down to specific programs. Third, developing a communication strategy. So people kind of expect a more direct, and especially on the digital side, we can have a more one-to-one personal conversation with them. Next, create a content strategy and gap analysis. So one of the questions we also always get is, where are we going to get all the content? And we always say, you have more than you believe. And there's always more content out there that's available that can be repurposed. And lastly, how do we prioritize specific service lines? So obviously, we're going to dive into that a little bit too.
So, and I think another important thing to touch on that, to kind of piggyback on your notes there, Brett, is these 5, they're not necessarily in priority order. These are kind of 5 key things that we always like to think about to really get rolling. Often, really identifying that key sponsor, internal champion, normally starts first, and then it almost always follows by the prioritization. After that, a lot of the rest kind of combines into those key activities. So really with that, we're a big firm believer in seeing examples, understanding the use cases. So in the next few slides, we figured it'd be helpful to actually dive into what do some of these actually look like. So you guys can have some examples and understand what those, how those actually translate into the real world. So we can hop in. We figured we'd start out with personas first. So as Brett mentioned, there's really kind of 2 levels of personas. We have what we kind of consider our broader or organizational personas. So these are at a higher level. So we know that these, in most healthcare organizations, there's really, most of the time we hear, 2 of them. It's the actual prospective patient and then the caregiver. What we actually see there being a few more. So we actually have 6 broken out, and we actually align it to our marketing funnel as we think that's how it really, when people go through that patient journey, how they align to it. So at the highest level of our organizational personas, we always look at what we look at as our preventative personas. We look at those as both passive and active personas. So when we think of a passive, preventative passive, this is someone who doesn't need medical treatment right now. They're a qualifying demographic, but they're not really searching for it. They're not actively looking for any kind of preventative information, screening. These are going to mostly fall into the, your common younger demographics, your millennials, where they're not engaging with healthcare facilities on a regular basis. So these are the ones they're going to have the hardest time engaging. This is normally where broader awareness tactics, the larger awareness months for, Heart Month and certain things like that, where you're going to be engaging and getting in front of these people. From there, moving into preventative active. These are the people that are out there that are actively looking for preventative information. These are people that are really, really keen and active on their health. So people, whether looking for screening information, wellness information, healthy eating or exercise information. So these are people who are not necessarily looking for treatment, but looking to engage with a thought leader in the healthcare space. And as you can continue to move down, as you get into treatment seeker, this is where someone's actually been diagnosed. This is also where that caregiver persona starts to come into play. So someone actually diagnosed, they're looking for, condition specific, whether it's, falls to maybe a heart and vascular service line, or falls to cancer service line, or falls to, even, something like mother, baby, or pediatrics. So this is where it's starting to get more specific. This is where more detailed information is going to be more impactful. So once again, that's why it's falling further down into that marketing funnel. And it isn't until we get into the provider seeker when people are actually going to be asking about a brand. Up to this point, it's pure educational they're looking for. As they get into provider seeker, this is when they start saying, well, what hospital system could really provide me this treatment? And what we often see is people tend to start with messaging for the provider seeker when people are still, preventative or treatment seeker in their healthcare or patient journey. Then from there, as you progress down, then it's the prospective patient. They're getting ready to take action. They're looking to build their treatment plan. Then, of course, that engaged patient, this is really when they're advocate of the healthcare system. This is once they're already engaged in working through their treatment and looking at what is rehab, what is next steps look as they work through this. So these are, at a high level, the organizational personas. These tend to transcend across all the service lines, not necessarily service line specific. And with that, we always suggest building program-specific personas. And this just allows you as a marketer to get far more specific, because if you're writing a marketing program for a certain service line and you're always going back to these higher level ones, it's harder to really bounce it off and validate it. So when we go into a more program-specific one, they start to take a little bit different shape. So we can see here, this is a few screenshots of a few simplified personas. This one was actually for a service line for new mothers, so mother-baby, new mothers. And when we were thinking about it, we know that these three personas, we have a loved one researching birthing options. So this is, a husband. We have Tom Smith, someone who's currently pregnant, researching birthing centers, Susan, and then considering pregnancy or researching clinical information with Beth. So what we see here is we get a lot more specific, where we're able to really leverage these for content creation. When Brett was talking about earlier of aligning communication strategies or communication priorities, when you get to this level, that process becomes easier. But in reality, they're really mapping back up. So when we see someone like, loved one researching birthing options, Tom here, we know that they're more in that preventative area where they're researching higher level, maybe getting a little bit into the treatment side, and then currently pregnant, they're probably more in that provider seeker. And then, considering pregnancy, this is going to be more in that treatment seeker. So having those two levels, defining at your organization, how do you want to message, but getting specific for your programs makes it a lot more easier to actually start building those out.
And creating that one-to-one personal conversation, right, Kyle?
Absolutely, exactly. Messaging the right content at the right time. With that, we really find once you know your personas, starting with that audience, when we actually go into start defining, well, what content makes sense, this is where Brett was saying, hey, often when we engage, people have a lot more content than they think. It's just not organized in a way that it's actionable yet. So we're a firm believer in doing content inventories, and these inventories naturally build a gap analysis for you. So this is a simple framework, once again, using the same mother-baby example that we were looking at before. And what we're able to do is then you go ahead and when you run down to the title, like, what's the content piece? And we define, okay, what is the type of content? And then from there, we start layering in, well, what's our communication priority? What does this content piece achieve? Is it helping someone from a persona perspective know what to expect? Do they know, why would you choose this healthcare facility? Or how would I actually engage? Or is this, talking about their personalized or multidisciplinary approach? So the communication priority really starts aligning to your content strategy. Then really pulling in the personas. So what personas does this speak to, as well as what stage does it speak to? So as you start inventorying your content in this way, what it tells you is, okay, well, hey, when we're looking at this, our caregiver persona doesn't have a lot of content. We should really beef up our caregiver content because we only have enough to maybe engage with them for maybe a week or two. Or from a stage perspective, hey, we have tons of content about why you should choose our healthcare facility, but we have nothing to really educate the user through their patient journey. So it starts incenting and giving you a reason of, okay, here's why we need to create this content and also what type of content we should be creating.
So I think Kyle, I think that's really right on point. So the other thing that we were talking about is service line prioritization. So when we think about what service lines or what disease and conditions specifically, or what service offering we want to market, we tend to think in terms of where is the highest consumer choice, because obviously we have to have something where we can influence choice as marketers. That's what we do, right? And then secondly is where's the value to the organization? Is it a high revenue, high margin type of activity? Is it one where we're looking to drive volume in a certain area? Maybe we're starting up a new practice. Like, we want to make these decisions on what service lines we're going to engage in a smart, intentional way, right? So in our example, we kind of layered in sort of a Gartner style map here, where we would see certain conditions, but it's really not, we're not really saying you should always do bariatrics. We're trying to just give you guys a tool to think about what service lines should be marketed and what shouldn't. Some organizations are going to look, some of our customers are very focused on specialty care and want to market those, others on primary. And we've seen great results in both ends of the spectrum. So I think that's a decision to make, but we want to make sure it's an intentional decision based on the requirements of the business.
Yeah, and I think some other levers that go into this too. So these are normally the first levers we always start with, and this helps kind of clear the noise. Some of the other levers that we often see is maybe there's idea of building reputation for a new service line. So, you know, just rolling out a new treatment approach. You know, maybe for advanced heart failure, you're investing more in LVADs, or either investing more in a certain type of procedure that might be new, although there might not necessarily be volume or maybe not high consumer choice yet, but you want to get out and build a reputation as a thought leader. So there's other levers that can kind of go into this, that could go ahead and influence that. So that's why this, as Brett said, this is more of a hypothetical. So each healthcare org is often going to have differences and nuances to this based on their priority. This kind of helps give you a starting point. Where do we even start from, from what service line, what condition, what approach?
And the other thing to keep in mind is what we stated earlier is especially as you're first getting started, you may want to pick a condition from, for example, orthopedics, and a condition from cancer, simply to engage across more of the organization. So you get multiple service line directors or marketing managers engaged in sort of building the groundswell for this type of activity.
And as you get to, we'll talk to it a little bit later in the presentation of kind of that crawl, walk, run approach. You'll start to find actually a lot of these are going to start filling into each other. So if you're driving, a program on mother baby, it's going to naturally progress into pediatrics or kids. And same with certain other disease conditions or service lines. They're going to have a natural overlap. So sometimes it's just getting something out there, getting started, and then you'll see natural progressions, how they interrelate and how they interconnect as you start to ramp up those key programs.
Okay, so I think this is a great segue, Kyle, to our next section of, how do we do it? So one of the things that we've said is that I guess we've seen successful in other customers is first kind of this idea of starting simple. So starting simple with a pilot, or starting simple with a smaller initiative, to sort of kind of help bring the concept out to the organization, but show some value, and be prepared to sort of understand how this can benefit the organization. The one warning I would give to starting simple, though, is always consider scalability. So think about when you're building out the pilots, how will this scale if we start with 5 programs, how will this scale to 100? How will it scale? How can we, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but always think about how we're going to scale and operationalize this from a marketing perspective, because otherwise, you might be a victim of your own success, right? So number 2 we're big fans of measuring everything. I mean, I think that's why we like digital marketing, right? So we can measure every interaction, measure every return, measure every click. And one of the things that we've always said is we should know how we're gonna measure success from the very beginning. Is it, or what types of ROIs do we think we can achieve? How are we gonna measure ROI? How are we gonna get that data back that we need to do that measurement? And understanding from the very beginning how we're gonna do that, because I think that's going to help us drive adoption as well. Next is always identifying integration points. So as we just sort of mentioned ROI, then we have to understand how to integrate with maybe the CRM system or data warehouse or an accounting system. Understand maybe our programs are going to leverage some sort of print-on-demand service, or they're going to leverage some sort of additional social technology pieces, and we want to capture all that information into our marketing database and know how those integration points are going to work. And lastly, but not last, again, not necessarily in order, as Kyle pointed out earlier, is defining governance. So what we found is that governance plays a really important role early on and as these programs become more mature, because they have to help, that program has to help prioritize and drive adoption, but in a responsible manner. So typically we see the governance role as, we meet monthly or every other month, and we talk about the types of activities or new types of programs that we'd like to consider and prioritize them. And sometimes there's questions, and those go off as working groups, and that's great, and they report back to the governance team. But setting up that structure early on, again, helps build buy-in, but also set priority and responsibility for the overall programs.
So with that, I'm always a big fan of Stephen Covey, and one of his big things with in his material is always start with the end in mind. And I think measurement is one of those that's often missed from that approach. Often people will launch a campaign, and once it ends, they'll go, hey, how successful was it? And they'll start saying, oh, let me figure it out. Let me dive into the details. When often instead we should really start before a campaign or a program launches and really start with what should be measured, what should be reported on, and who is it being reported to. So we typically see a lot of times organizations will go directly to what we call vanity metrics. And not that vanity metrics are bad, they're just not telling you the full story of how it's impacted your bottom line. So often we'll see people go directly to the impressions or click-through rate or time on site to go ahead and say, hey, here's how our campaign performed. And while those metrics may be impactful in your marketing team or your boiler room where you're creating campaigns and understanding if top of the funnel's converting well, but ultimately if you're going and talking to your executive team or any leadership, what they're probably more interested in is, well, what was the ROI? How much return or how much contribution margin was driven based on these programs? Or, what was our cost per acquisition? How much does it cost for us to get a new patient in X service line? How much does it cost to get a new patient as it relates to this certain specialty care? And those KPIs are very important. And if you don't have the certain infrastructure set up ahead of time, the right technology, the right measures in place, it's very hard to reverse engineer and get here. So it's very important when you start any program, certainly as Brett was talking about from a pilot program perspective, have those conversations early. When you have your governance committee, have the conversations early of what do we want to report on? How do we get these metrics, and how do we operationalize it? We'll talk about that a bit more here in a bit. But how do we operationalize it so it doesn't take an inordinate amount of time or resources to be able to produce these reports? How can you get those live time and understand how programs are working as they're unfolding, not 3 months after they finish? With that, we can hop to the next slide, and we'll kind of talk a little bit more.
Hey, Kyle, that reminds me, my favorite story on the measurement side is always the client that thought that they were running paid search for both on Google and Bing, and Bing was converting higher at the form fill, but Google more highly performing at the sale or the actual acquisition of the patient. And I thought that was really telling, because had we not measured that all the way through and we'd stuck with vanity metrics, we would have thought to put more money on the Bing side. And really, the answer was to put more on Google, right? Because that's what we were ultimately here to do, is drive acquisition, not form fills.
Absolutely. No, I think you hit the nail on the head. And looking at that, certainly when you're launching a multi-channel approach, digital and traditional mixed, being able to measure those uniquely and see, well, what, when we look at our, our cost per acquisition, not all leads are the same. If a lead drives through from one channel but not the other, understanding, not just program acquisition costs, but what's the channel acquisition cost, and channel conversion rate. So I think you definitely hit a nail on the head there. So with that, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about what some of these metrics are. So these are the ones that we find most important and the ones that we like to report on most often. And we thought it'd be beneficial to kind of align it. Each box really aligns to what platform or what technology we leverage to actually pull that information from. And really, this is a mix of both our vanity and KPI metrics that we're looking on the previous slide. So often at the highest kind of top of the funnel from an ad tech or analytics perspective. So whether you're pulling this from your Google Analytics or directly from your advertising vendor or advertising software, that's the highest level. So seeing in brand impressions, this is definitely a vanity metric. However, it is impactful to see how many people are seeing your ads. What, from a brand awareness perspective, how many people are we getting in front of, even though they might not all be taking action, but how many people are engaging with us? Getting down into things like time on site or page views. Your page views are going to be a direct reflection of how many people click through from your ads onto your site. Once again, it's beneficial to look and to track to see, hey, as we're driving more volume, is our relevancy staying there? If our volume's going up and our time on site's going down and other metrics are moving, is that a bad correlation? So at a high level, pulling from ad tech and analytics, that's where you're able to pull some of these first few. From there, as we move further down the funnel and measurement, in your email system or your marketing automation system, you're able to pull a lot of your email metrics here. So what's your bounce rate? So bounce rate's going to look at pretty much the quality of the leads generated. So are people putting misinformation in? Are they putting bad emails in? And in turn, emails are bouncing when you're trying to send them out to the end users. In turn, what's that delivery rate? What's the open rate on these emails? How are people clicking through on these? So what's the click-through rate? And depending on the platform you use, there's even some more advanced metrics where you could go ahead and take a look at, well, what's the click to open? So if the people who actually opened and read our email, how many took action? So definitely, as you're looking at your email and marketing automation system, seeing how those nurtures are working, those are definitely more beneficial. Once again, still vanity metrics, but beneficial information to know. So when you're trying to improve, hey, we want more people to engage in our email or click through our emails, those vanity metrics are impactful to improve that. But these first two chunks, that we're looking at here are often not the ones you want to report up to your executive staff. And the last one, when we're looking at the integration of marketing automation and a CRM system, whether that's, an out-of-the-box CRM system, or if it's your, data warehouse for your organization, looking at things like ROI, your return on investment, how much, and it doesn't have to look at your total marketing cost baked in. That could just be looking at return on investment of advertising spend. So, we spent X amount on the ad networks and we made X amount in contribution margin or revenue. Looking at your opportunities per revenue, cost per acquisition, for a net new lead for the Digestive Disease Institute, it costs us $200 per lead or $300 per lead. So understanding what that cost per acquisition is definitely beneficial, especially knowing what average patient contributions are. So seeing that lead quality. So one of a very good and solid tactic in marketing automation is lead scoring. So what are the key activities that an end user would take? And we increment that score to understand the lead quality. So, not all leads are created equal. If someone downloads a content piece, enters into your marketing program, and never takes action again, they don't have the same lead quality as someone who's engaged in your nurtures all the way through and have taken additional actions post-conversion at the top of the funnel. So looking at that lead quality is very important. Additionally, funnel stage per channel. So when we think of our marketing funnel, where we break it down in Highland Group, when we talk about awareness and interest and engaged and our desire and action, what leads, this is where Brett was going a little bit with, Google versus Bing, what channels are progressing leads through the most? So in the one example, Bing was getting more people through the top of the funnel, but Google was driving through more through bottom of the funnel. We're able to align at that and understand that. And, we want to then with digital, stop doing the things that aren't driving patients, start doing more of what is. So being able to adapt and see that information, especially being able to see that information lifetime, you can improve and optimize your campaigns while it's still running. Not doing it post-mortem and saying, well, we'll try this differently next year with more budget. And on that, looking at that funnel stage velocity. So how quickly are people moving through each one of those stages? And a great measure, especially if you're able to report this to your executive board, is saying, hey, previously it took a marketing source lead to become a net new patient. It used to take 30 days. If you implement a nurture program, you could say, hey, instead of 30 days, it takes 15 days. That's an incredible metric, saying, hey, we sped up the timeline of a new patient by almost half. So being able to have those measures in place with the right technology, it empowers you to really be able to drive to say, here's why we need more budget. Here's why these programs are working. So with that, we always get the question. So on all those measurements, we always get the same questions of like, well, I can't show ROI. I don't have the revenue data to be able to say, hey, here's how much money we've made from this program, or how do we match this back to where we can actually match that patient back to the marketing program. And there's HIPAA-related information. We want to make we don't want to obviously be breaking any regulatory any regulations or any laws. So we often get that question, and really we put, this is obviously a slightly simplified chart, but we're going to kind of present the idea of, well, how do you actually achieve this? And really it's key technology that lets you do it. And we really look at it at 3 levels, and the 3 levels make sure that you're operating in a way that follows regulations, but also make sure that you're able to match back and be able to say, here's how much revenue was driven by this program, or here's how much revenue was driven by this program. So really at the highest level, this is operationally in your healthcare org, so your finance database and patient database. So those are normally self-contained information. And from there, the next layer that we often see is either an internal data warehouse. So this could be a team that's got integrated data on-premise, or other organizations invest in out-of-the-box CRM. So this could take the shape of some bigger players in the space, or things like Tea Leaves, Healthgrades, Salesforce is coming out with a healthcare-focused CRM. And what that does, that kind of has that layer, that integration with those 2 systems to be able to see, is someone a patient? If so, how much contribution margin is associated to it? So that's that first layer. And the next layer down is your marketing automation or your marketing database. And that's where all the marketing campaigns are on. So the goal is, in that marketing database where you're operating and running your programs, no patient identified information or health identified information is existing in there. It's purely self-identified by the end user. When they engage in your marketing program, self-identified information they provide you, and then you capture that and pass it through. So as you capture that information, you'll have to work with your data warehouse team to understand what information is needed to do accurate matching. But you pass that information down, it runs through the internal processes that are already part of your organization, and in turn, key information is sent back in that marketing platform. And we're not talking about information that says Jimmy broke his leg, or, you know, Susie had this procedure. It's just, you know, patient yes, no. It's just key information saying, hey, this person became a patient, and the key information related to give attribution back to the marketing program. So conceptually, this is at a high level how you can integrate it. Obviously, there's a lot of inner workings there to make sure that you find success with it. But we wanted to kind of give a boilerplate on this. I don't know, Brett, if there's anything you wanted to add on this before we hop to the next slide.
All I would say is this is also another area where sometimes we get some wide-eyed looks. And I think the answer there is a couple of things. One is think about what we want it to be, right? We talked about that scalability. Think about how we want it to work, but don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? Like we've done programs where we've had contribution margin, and we've done programs where we've had patient numbers and estimated contribution. And as long as we all agree on how we're estimating them, that's okay, right? Like that's a good start, right? Is it as good as having the real data? Of course not, but it's a great start, and it's probably a level of, it could be a level of analytics that people aren't used to seeing already, so it could take some time to get completely there. So that would be my only thing to add, Kyle.
Sounds good. So, so I mean, with that, I think it naturally transitions into, well, how do we operationalize this to find scale? So I think understanding what measures you want in place, understanding how the integrations work, those are all the baseline areas where you want to start, you know, when we're talking that governance committee, making sure everyone's talking that same language, you know, having technology involved early to make sure those integrations will work are very important. And from there, the next step, once you have that key information, is how do you operationalize this? How do you make programs to where every program isn't its own custom big project, but how do we make it to where we have the core best practices worked in, and you're able to just scale by adding more to it? And really with that, we call it our center of excellence approach. And we really find that there's generally about 6 types of programs that we see most successful with healthcare organizations. And certainly there's going to be customizations. We'll kind of get to that in a bit. There'll be customizations of each. But generally, it boils down to 6 main things. And what those really map out to be, as you can see here. So patient generation. So this is going to be hyper-targeted patient acquisition. This is going to be going down to, you know, disease condition specific information. When we're thinking about the personas that we talked about earlier, this is the treatment seeker. It's someone who's ready to take action, or a caregiver who's searching on behalf of their loved one. This is the, you know, most tried and true type of program we see most often. The next one is events or webinars. So we see this being really impactful from even a population health perspective when we think of our initiatives, or when we're thinking about our personas. These could really be impactful across all the personas. So we've seen more general ones, you know, where it's, you know, earlier in the funnel talking about higher level topics, and then even seeing somewhere maybe it's you know, a chat with the physician, and it's really addressing bottom of the funnel questions. We see those be very successful. Also, community events, once again, talking to that you know, that passive persona. Direct marketing, it's still very, very effective channel, being able to send specific information to your key demographics. Nurture campaigns, these are really impactful. It helps drive people from top of the funnel kind of interest, you know, the very beginning research phases of their patient journey, and driving them all the way through. So these are really kind of the bread and butter of working someone through the journey, aligning, you know, their key communication priorities to content. And then targeted announcements. So sometimes you just, you know, there's a one-off email send. You know, this is where a newsletter could maybe roll in. This is where there's more kind of alert style or email blasts that go out. And then finally, multi-channel integration. So looking at the advertising perspective, you know, aligning all those key pieces and coordinating into those key campaigns. So with that, knowing, with those kind of key, kind of 6 center of excellence pieces in mind, we really like to align those key things to a crawl, walk, run. So even though it's boiled down to 6, it's still daunting at times of, I've defined my personas, we've prioritized our service lines, and we want to do a patient acquisition program. So, you've made it through some of the tougher decisions, and now you get there and you go, man, where do I start? So with that, we like to think of the crawl, walk, run, and we've kind of give them other names, basic, standard, and enhanced. And the idea behind here is, instead of starting off at that customized level, maybe it's starting, getting a few things out there. Start with the basic program. You have a key landing page, you have a key thank you page, thank you email, and maybe there's a simple advertising brief or a campaign brief where you're just going to talk about a certain concept. Very simple, from a content perspective, you're not generating a whole bunch of assets, you're just getting it started, seeing, hey, will people engage with this content piece, this gated asset, whether it's a treatment guide or maybe a fact sheet or other key information. And then from there, you can build on it. So once you have a few basic programs out there, you can start improving on them, bring it up to the walk phase or a standard phase. Maybe it's adding in more of a nurture stream. So once someone converts on that content piece, what more can we be adding to it? Maybe we have 4, 5, 6 drip emails associated to it. You can, evolve out on, more of a multi-channel digital marketing plan. So maybe at basic, you're just starting off with, paid social. Maybe there's a print piece that's coming that's tied to it, from a direct sale piece. Maybe in here you go more multi-channel. Maybe you incorporate search and social. Maybe include some programmatic display. So build on it. Get the base works and grow, and then from there growing into more of an enhanced program. So maybe it's multiple nurture streams. So for your program you have 2 or 3 different personas. Well, how should we message them differently? Let's create content that's unique to each persona, and let's really come up with a customized approach. So every program doesn't have to be an enhanced program, but certainly, start simpler and build on it. See the programs that are getting early results and go from there.
Yeah, I think we always know we've obtained a modicum of success when a client says, hey, Brett, I think we want to do a standard program here, but we want to add 1 email to the nurture. So we're already halfway there, right? We already know what we're doing. We already understand the general scope of it. We already kind of generally know we're already talking the same vernacular, which is great. And the second point I would make is, as Kyle was saying, some programs are basic and they're basic forever, and that's okay. And other programs are basic at first and then they become enhanced later, and that's okay too. It's all about, like as Kyle was saying, starting where we're starting with a little kind of the crawl, walk, run. Lastly, we want to talk a little bit about you bouncing around a little there?
This one. Sorry.
I think we're right to the next one.
One more. There we go.
There we go.
Sorry. Go ahead, Brett.
Sorry about that, folks. So last one, we wanted to jump into a little key initiative. We thought patient acquisition was one that everyone would relate to. I think it's been it's something that every healthcare marketer is constantly being asked. And I think one of the things we're going to look at is a real program. We've had these programs, again, they've been a combination of basic, standard, enhanced, as Kyle was saying. Several different versions of this is instituted. We see lead to patient ratios as high as 10% and sometimes higher, and we've seen ROIs reach the triple digits. So these are great programs, and I think the thing that we're trying to sort of say with the diagram below is really just organizing and streamlining our efforts, making sure that we're not doing random acts of marketing, that we've got a plan, that we're implementing the plan, and we're measuring and optimizing those programs effectively. So With that, let's jump into the example.
Awesome, sweet. So we thought it'd be beneficial for the example to kind of touch on some of the top of the funnel, kind of break it up by the funnel. So top of the funnel, middle of the funnel, and go from there. So top of the funnel, really want to touch on what advertising channels are working, what have been most impactful. And we went ahead and listed a handful here. What we're seeing, search engines are still the main staple. So 86% of patients conduct a health-related search before booking a doctor's appointment. People go to Google right away with any health question. We're seeing social media really drive up, especially Facebook, being one of the highest converting lead sources. It also has less competition when compared to other search engines, so it tends to have a lower cost per acquisition than other channels. Email newsletters are still tried and true. They're often, people think of them being a little antiquated, but what we find is often people will enter into a marketing database and not convert to a patient right away. And these newsletters are re-engaging the brand. They're bringing the brand top of mind, and we actually see them actually drive a very high conversion rate and really in turn build brand advocates. So people are sharing that content. Remarketing and retargeting, another piece, need to be done very carefully of re-engaging people who have already came to your website digitally. So this is another one. If done well, it has a very good engagement rate. You got to balance that creepiness factor, especially in healthcare. We're talking about people's kind of healthcare journey, so making sure we're balancing that well. Display advertising, obviously a key staple in digital. This is one at the highest level. It's really good from brand awareness. It doesn't typically drive as much lead generation. And then lastly, your corporate website. So most commonly missed tactic is people leveraging call to actions on their website and in turn driving it through to their marketing programs. We also wanted to give a relevant example of middle to the bottom of the funnel tactics. So this is just an example of what a nurture program could look like. So what a multi-step nurture program could look like. So when someone enters in on that landing page, asking some key information, using progressive profiling to understand what's unique about that end user, and then making sure they're going into relevant nurture streams, relevant information. So in this example, branching off and getting information related to hip pain versus knee pain. And in turn, based on the content they engage in, will they get served with more surgery content versus therapy? So really just understanding, well, what content is relevant? How can we get very personalized, very quickly, and making sure we're sending the right content at the right time. So nurture streams are very impactful to drive people from mid-funnel down to bottom funnel, and in turn converting to patients.
And when we do it right, we also reduce that time to patient conversion, which is also a critical element.
Absolutely. And then our last one here, so we're thinking of main tactics. We always like to come back to that measurement and optimization. So when you're thinking of ways to report, we always break it down into 3 types of levels. Your weekly pacing, how are you producing on a weekly basis, how are you trending to budget? On a monthly perspective, this is getting into more of the key performance factors, getting more into those KPIs of how many leads are being generated, how many marketing qualified leads, how many patients are being generated. So a lot more of those KPIs are working in that monthly dashboard. And then quarterly, we like to benchmark. So when you first get started, maybe it's benchmarking against industry trends. But more importantly, as you continue to grow your campaigns, it's starting to benchmark against your own organization. So how are you improving? How are you doing compared to other service lines? And really having that topic of how do we continue to optimize and improve and build on these. So once again, coming back to that measurement piece as it's very impactful. So with that, we want to hit key takeaways real quick. I know we're running a little long, so we want to make sure we leave time for your guys' questions. So we'll hit the key takeaways, and then we can open it up back over to Scott to run through some of the questions. So from a key takeaway, so always start with your audience. Know who you're talking to and what pain points they have. So really start with those personas. Understand what measurements you need as a marketer and what you need for leaderships. These metrics are commonly different. So making sure you understand what to measure and those key aspects of it. Number 3, use the crawl, walk, run methodology to get started. It's really easy to get overwhelmed and take bite off more than you can chew here. So really start simple and build on it, improve on it, optimize it. Number 4, speak to the audience where they live and personalize the communication based on their unique place in their patient journey. So once again, going back to the personas, align those personas in your content to the unique journeys and make sure they're getting the right information. And then our last one, number 5, is start your governance committee early. Make sure you're including marketing, technology, leadership. Include all those key people so you can talk about integrations and requirements earlier. So those were our main key takeaways. With that, we'll go ahead. We'll turn it over to Scott. It looks like we have a handful of questions submitted. So Scott, we'll toss it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. So we had a question come in around ROI and tracking. Can you share what identifiers we've used for our clients to tie the patient back to the marketing program?
Yeah, definitely. No, that's a good question. Normally, it's a mix of a handful of different things. So it's normally not just one piece. Typically, most of our clients are looking to match at least name, zip code, and date of birth. Most of our clients with their data team have over a 90% confidence of the match there. There's other criteria we can layer on top of that, but we obviously want to balance, balance the form conversion rate. If we ask too many questions, people will be less likely to convert. So typically those 3 are the core ones. Obviously we want email address to drive follow-up nurtures, but email address typically isn't a matching point. Most healthcare systems still aren't capturing that on their patient database or on their back end. So I don't know, Brett, if there's anything else you want to add on top of that.
No, I think that's right, and I think the key again is don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? We can do perfect matching in the accounting system. We want the marketing system to be really good and give us the right amount of direction on the strategy.
Great, thanks, guys. So I know you mentioned remarketing earlier. We had a question coming around that. So we've had pushback from legal on using remarketing technology. How do you combat this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kyle. I'll take that one. So I think the question is always what and how you're remarketing, right? So obviously we can't remarket and say, hey, we saw you. We're not selling shoes, right? We can't say, hey, I saw you were shopping for these shoes and the shoes follow you around. We're not suggesting that necessarily. We're suggesting a couple of things. One is if a person is on your website and we know because of their marketing information that they are perhaps we want to reactivate them and we've already communicated with them, it's okay to show branded messages, right? It's okay to show information about the system and we don't have to be too specific. Secondly, where we've seen remarketing is sometimes outside the clinical areas as well. So if you're doing physician communications or education-related communications or other things outside the typical patient communications, then remarketing is another great tool with very little, what we've seen is very little pushback from legal. So, sometimes we have to keep it higher levels than we would like as marketers, and that's just the world we live in as healthcare marketers. So, Kyle, what do you want to add anything on that?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head on that one.
Great, thanks, guys. So we talked a lot about personas today. How many personas should an organization have? Is there a right or wrong number?
Yeah, definitely. There's not really a right or wrong number, I guess, to answer it quickly. So yeah, there isn't a perfect number. Typically, most organizations we work with, when we think of the organizational level personas, we typically see anywhere between 2 to 5 at the highest level. When you get into the program specific, depending on how many programs you spin up, we've had some organization with 70 unique personas, and although 70 seems like a big number, they really map back to those organizational ones. So it's really just adding that level of detail or granularity to make sure you can be as relevant as you can in your marketing program. So there isn't a perfect number. Organizationally, you don't want to be over 5 because then it's very hard to message to all those people effectively and accurately. Brett, anything on your end?
Yeah, I think the key is less about the number and more about the intent. So my example is always when we're building a website, we build it for the general healthcare consumer, and we know that she's a mom or a wife. Typically, she's you know, a certain age. You know, we're building. We have to be very broad, and that's okay, and that's what we can do on the web, right? When we get into some of our detailed marketing, and we're talking to a person in advanced heart failure, for example, we now know they have certain motivations and concerns. You know, we can address those. We can talk directly to those concerns if we know who they are because they've Googled it and they've already kind of told us who they are, right? We can have tie very specific content to their specific motivations and concerns. And that's what we mean getting it very granular and getting it down to the point where we're saying, okay, this person is actually, you know, a little older. They are frustrated that they can't do more activities with their grandkids or kids, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And we can make that communication much more impactful.
Great, thanks, Brett. It looks like we have a couple more minutes. So one last question here. How do you measure both digital and traditional marketing tactics when running a program like this?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, I guess I'll hop into kind of a tactical approach to it. From a digital perspective, it's pretty straightforward. So you're driving people from a digital channel to a digital asset. So the tracking is a lot easier. There's a lot of technologies out there from like a Google Analytics perspective, or even from your marketing automation perspective, where you can track that pretty easy with some, you know, unique UTM tagging or unique marketing tagging to be able to track that. So that one's a little bit easier. Traditional is a little bit tougher, depending on what your tactic is. We're a big firm believer in vanity URLs. And it's not a new topic, but the idea of making sure we have unique URLs or call tracking tied to those key pieces, and they redirect with that key information tied to it. So if you have a print piece, making sure that print piece redirects to a tag URL. So maybe they'd have, you know, www.company.org/ you know, campaign name, and when someone hits that, it actually redirects to the actual asset with all the related information tagged to it. So that way, when we're reporting, all channels are kind of a little bit more equal there. We're able to go ahead and see, well, how many, you know, visits and leads were generated from each one of these channels, and you can begin to measure the two. Typically, though, depending on some of those traditional tactics, they aren't as equal. You know, a billboard, you know, can't be held to the same account as a paid search ad, just because they often have different goals associated to them. But if you want to measure a cost per acquisition, you know, of your patients, by doing those vanity URLs on the traditional stuff, you're at least able to then compare Google drives, you know, patients at this cost, while billboards drive them at this cost. Brett, I don't know if you got anything on your end you want to add.
No, I think it's right on. I think the key thing you said there, Kyle, was the goal, right? So if in a billboard is a perfect example where the goal of that is probably not acquisition, right? It's probably broader brand recognition, right? Or sponsorship, right? Of a team or an event. And we just have to have those goals aligned going into it, right? If we do, and then obviously when we integrate them into a fully a multi-tactic campaign, then doing the things you mentioned are absolutely right on point.
Great. Well, thanks, Kyle and Brett. It looks like we're just about out of time here today, so I wanted to thank everyone for jumping on and joining us. We hope you learned a few new things about healthcare marketing today. We did record today's webinar, so we'll be following up with a recording of that, and then a blog post as well to summarize some of the highlights that we discussed today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and happy marketing.